The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Sarah felt the sharp pangs of hunger pierce through her empty stomach once again. She pulled her thin shawl closer around her shoulders, trying to shield herself and her twin babies from the cold wind that swept across the plantation grounds. The babies, only 8 months old, whimpered softly in her arms. Their tiny faces were gaunt, their cheeks hollow from weeks of insufficient nourishment. Sarah had been a slave on the Whitmore plantation for nearly 6 years. She remembered the day she arrived. Barely 16 years old, torn away from her family and sold to Master Whitmore like a piece of livestock. The years had been hard, filled with backbreaking labor in the cotton fields, under the scorching sun and bitter cold. But nothing had prepared her for the struggle she now faced as a mother trying to keep her children alive. The twins, Mary and Samuel, had been born during the harshest winter the region had seen in decades. Food rations for slaves had been cut in half due to poor crop yields, and what little they received was barely enough to keep one person alive, let alone a nursing mother feeding 2 infants. Sarah's milk had dried up weeks ago from malnutrition, and she watched helplessly as her babies grew weaker each day. The other slaves on the plantation tried to help when they could, sharing scraps of bread or watery soup, but everyone was suffering. Old Tom, who had been on the plantation longer than anyone could remember, often gave Sarah his portion of cornmeal, claiming he wasn't hungry. But Sarah could see the truth in his tired eyes. He was just as starved as the rest of them. Master Whitmore was not a cruel man by the standards of his time, but he was indifferent to the suffering of his slaves. He saw them as investments, tools to work his land and increase his wealth. As long as they could perform their duties, their personal struggles were of no concern to him. His wife, Mrs. Whitmore, occasionally showed moments of sympathy, but she was too afraid of her husband's disapproval to act on her compassionate impulses. The plantation was located in the remote hills of Northern California, far from the main settlements. It was 1872, and though slavery had been officially abolished, many isolated plantations continued operating under the old system, keeping their workers trapped through debt, fear, and geographic isolation. The nearest town was a 3-day walk through dangerous territory, and few slaves had ever attempted the journey. Sarah had tried everything she could think of to find food for her babies. She had begged the plantation cook, Mrs. Jenkins, for kitchen scraps. She had searched the grounds for edible roots and berries. She had even considered stealing from the main house, but the consequences of being caught would be severe, possibly death. As the days passed, the twins grew weaker. Mary, the smaller of the two, barely had the strength to cry anymore. Samuel fought harder, his tiny fists clenching and unclenching as he struggled against the hunger that consumed him. Sarah held them close, singing soft lullabies that her own mother had sung to her years ago, trying to comfort them with her voice when she had no food to offer. One particularly difficult night, as Sarah sat in the cramped slave quarters listening to her baby's weak cries, she made a desperate decision. She would leave the plantation and search for help, even if it meant risking everything. She couldn't watch her children waste away any longer. If they were going to die, she would rather it be while fighting for their lives than while waiting helplessly for the end. The next morning, Sarah wrapped the twins in the only blanket she owned and prepared to leave. She told old Tom of her plan, and he shook his head sadly but didn't try to stop her. He understood a mother's desperation. He gave her a small piece of dried meat he had saved from his rations, the last of his food. Sarah set out just before dawn, when the overseer was still sleeping and the other slaves were beginning their morning chores. She walked quickly but carefully, trying to put distance between herself and the plantation before anyone noticed she was gone. The twins were quiet, too weak to make much noise, and Sarah took this as both a blessing and a terrifying sign of how close they were to the end. The terrain beyond the plantation was rough and unfamiliar. Sarah had never ventured far from the cotton fields, and she quickly realized she had no idea where she was going. She followed what appeared to be an old deer trail, hoping it would lead to water or some sign of civilization. Her feet, bare and unprotected, were soon cut and bleeding from the rocky ground. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah's own strength began to fade. She hadn't eaten anything substantial in 2 days, saving what little food she could find for the babies. But they were too weak to take much nourishment. And she watched helplessly as they seemed to slip further away from her, with each passing hour. By midday, Sarah collapsed beside a small stream. She cupped the cool water in her hands and tried to give some to the twins, but they could barely swallow. The water helped ease her own burning thirst, but she knew that water alone wouldn't save her children. They needed real food, and they needed it soon. Sarah looked around desperately, searching for any sign of help. The landscape was beautiful, but desolate. Rolling hills covered in oak trees and wild grass. With no signs of human habitation, she began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake by leaving the plantation. At least there, they had shelter and the small possibility of finding scraps of food. Out here, they had nothing. As afternoon turned to evening, Sarah's situation became increasingly dire. The twins had stopped responding to her touch. Their breathing shallow and irregular. She held them close, feeling their tiny bodies growing cold despite the warm day. Tears streamed down her face as she realized she might be watching her children die in her arms. Just as despair was about to overwhelm her completely, Sarah heard the sound of horse hooves approaching. Her heart raced with a mixture of hope and terror. It could be help, but it could just as easily be slave catchers, or someone who would turn her in for the bounty on runaway slaves. Through the trees, she saw a lone rider approaching the stream. The figure was tall and moved with confident ease on horseback. As the rider drew closer, Sarah could see it was a man with long, dark hair and weathered features that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His clothes were simple but well-made, and he carried himself with a dignity that impressed her even in her desperate state. The man stopped his horse near the stream and dismounted. He moved slowly and deliberately, as if he understood that sudden movements might frighten her. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I see you and your little ones need help," he said, his eyes taking in their condition with quick assessment. "I am called Modoc." Sarah had heard stories of the Modoc people from other slaves. They were a proud tribe that had fought fiercely to protect their land and their way of life. She had heard they sometimes helped runaway slaves, but she had never dared to hope she might encounter one. Modoc approached slowly, his hands visible and open to show he meant no harm. When he was close enough to see the twins clearly, his expression grew grave. He knelt down beside Sarah, studying the babies with the practiced eye of someone who had seen suffering before. "These children are very sick," he said simply. "They need food and medicine, and they need it quickly." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper when she replied, "We're starving. Please, help us. I don't know what to do." Modoc was quiet for a moment, considering the situation. Sarah could see him weighing options in his mind, calculating risks and possibilities. Finally, he looked directly into her eyes with an expression of firm resolve. "I'll feed you," he said. "Follow me. Follow me." The simple words carried more hope than Sarah had felt in months. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time since her children were born, she felt that survival might be possible. Modoc's quiet confidence gave her strength she didn't know she still possessed. Modoc helped Sarah to her feet and gently took one of the twins while she carried the other. His touch was careful and respectful, and Sarah could feel the genuine compassion in his actions. He led her to his horse, a sturdy animal that seemed as calm and reliable as its owner. "My village is not far," Modoc explained as he helped her mount the horse. "We have food and medicine. Your children will be cared for." As they rode through the fading daylight, Sarah allowed herself to hope for the first time in weeks. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew that this moment marked a turning point in their desperate journey. The twins were still breathing, still fighting, and now they were riding toward help with a man who had shown them more kindness in 5 minutes than they had experienced in months. The landscape gradually changed as they rode deeper into Modoc territory. The hills became more rugged, the trees denser. Sarah could smell wood smoke in the air, and she knew they were approaching human settlement. The scent filled her with anticipation and nervous energy. Modoc rode with steady purpose, occasionally checking on the twins and asking Sarah how she was feeling. His concern seemed genuine, and Sarah found herself trusting this stranger, who had appeared when all hope seemed lost. She wondered what had brought him to the stream at exactly the right moment. But she was too grateful to question the miracle. As darkness fell, they could see the warm glow of fires in the distance. Modoc's village lay ahead, and with it, the possibility of salvation for Sarah and her dying children. The Modoc village appeared before them like a vision of warmth and life after the cold desperation Sarah had known for so long. Small fires flickered throughout the settlement, casting dancing shadows on carefully constructed dwellings made of wood and earth. The air was filled with the rich aroma of cooking food, and Sarah's stomach cramped with desperate hunger at the smell. People emerged from their homes as Modoc's horse approached. Word seemed to spread quickly through the village, and soon a small group had gathered to greet them. Sarah clutched the twins closer, uncertain of what reception awaited them. She had heard conflicting stories about how different tribes treated strangers, especially those fleeing slavery. An elderly woman with silver hair braided with colorful beads stepped forward from the group. Her face was lined with years of wisdom and experience, but her eyes were sharp and alert. She spoke to Modoc in their native language, her tone urgent but controlled. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she recognized the universal language of concern in the woman's voice. Modoc dismounted quickly and helped Sarah down from the horse. The twins were limp in their arms, their breathing barely perceptible. The elderly woman, who Sarah would later learn was called Gentle Rain, immediately took charge of the situation. She barked orders to the younger people around her, sending them running in different directions. "Bring warm milk," she called to one. "Heat water for bathing," she told another. "Wake the medicine woman," she instructed a third. The villagers moved with practiced efficiency, as if they had dealt with such emergencies before. Gentle Rain gently took Mary from Sarah's arms and examined the baby with experienced hands. Her touch was soft but thorough as she checked the infant's pulse, breathing, and general condition. Her expression grew increasingly serious as she assessed the extent of the child's weakness. "How long since they last ate?" Gentle Rain asked Modoc in English, understanding that Sarah needed to be part of this conversation. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Days. Maybe a week, for anything substantial. My milk stopped coming weeks ago." Gentle Rain nodded gravely. "They are very close to the spirit world. We must act quickly, but carefully. Too much food too fast will shock their systems." A young woman approached carrying a bowl of warm goat's milk mixed with what appeared to be herbs. Gentle Rain took the bowl and carefully dipped her finger into the mixture, then placed a few drops on Mary's lips. The baby didn't respond at first, but after several attempts, her tiny tongue moved slightly to taste the nourishment. Meanwhile, another woman had brought a similar mixture for Samuel. Modoc held the boy gently, while the woman administered tiny amounts of the milk mixture. Samuel's response was slightly stronger than his sister's, giving everyone present a small spark of hope. "We need to warm them slowly," Gentle Rain explained to Sarah. "Their bodies have begun shutting down to preserve life. We must coax them back to health gradually." Sarah was led to a dwelling near the center of the village. The interior was warm and comfortable, with woven mats on the floor and baskets containing various supplies hanging from the walls. A small fire burned in a carefully constructed pit, providing both warmth and light. The space felt like a sanctuary after the harsh conditions of the plantation. Several women from the village had gathered to help care for the twins. They worked in shifts, constantly monitoring the baby's breathing and administering tiny amounts of nourishment every few minutes. They warmed stones by the fire and wrapped them in soft cloths to place near the baby's bodies, raising their body temperature slowly and safely. The medicine woman, an ancient figure named Wise Owl, arrived after being awakened from sleep. She moved slowly but with purpose, carrying a collection of pouches and containers filled with various herbs and remedies. She examined both babies carefully, pressing her ear to their chests and studying their color and breathing patterns. "These children have been visited by the hunger spirit," Wise Owl, announced after her examination. But their own spirits are still strong. They want to live. We can help them. But it will take time and constant care. Wise Owl prepared a special tea from herbs she carried, explaining that it would help the babies' bodies process the little food they could take. She also mixed a paste made from ground roots that she applied gently to their temples and wrists, claiming it would help strengthen their life force. As the women cared for the twins, other villagers attended to Sarah's needs. They brought her warm soup made from vegetables and meat. But like her children, she had to eat slowly and in small amounts. Her body, too, was weakened from prolonged hunger, and sudden heavy eating could make her violently ill. The soup was unlike anything Sarah had tasted in years. Rich and flavorful, with chunks of tender meat and perfectly cooked vegetables. It seemed to bring strength back to her body with every spoonful. The women watched her eat, nodding approvingly when she managed to finish the bowl. "You must rebuild your strength," Gentle Rain explained. "Your children will need your care as they recover, and you cannot help them if you are weak." As the night progressed, Sarah learned more about her rescuers and their village. The Modoc people had faced their own struggles with the expanding white settlements and government policies that threatened their way of life. Many of their people had been killed or displaced over the years, but this group had managed to maintain their community in the remote hills. Despite their own challenges, they had a long tradition of helping those in need, regardless of race or background. Modoc himself had been instrumental in establishing an informal network that aided runaway slaves and other refugees seeking freedom and safety. "We know what it means to fight for survival," Modoc explained to Sarah as they sat by the fire. "We know what it means to have your children threatened by forces beyond your control. When we see others facing such struggles, we cannot turn away." Throughout the night, the village women maintained their vigil over the twins. They took turns holding the babies, keeping them warm, and administering small amounts of nourishment. Gradually, both children began to show signs of improvement. Their breathing became more regular, and their body temperature stabilized. Mary was the first to open her eyes and look around with awareness. When she saw Sarah's face, she made a small sound that wasn't quite a cry but was clearly an attempt at communication. Sarah burst into tears of relief and gratitude, unable to believe that her daughter was actually responding. Samuel's improvement came more slowly, but by dawn, he too had opened his eyes and was accepting the milk mixture more readily. The medicine woman declared that both children had turned the corner and would likely survive, though they would need careful monitoring and gradual feeding for several days. As the sun rose over the village, Sarah felt a profound sense of transformation. Just 24 hours earlier, she had been sitting by a stream watching her children die in her arms. Now, they were warm, fed, and showing clear signs of recovery. The change seemed almost miraculous. The villagers were preparing for their daily activities, but many continued to check on Sarah and the twins throughout the morning. Children from the village brought flowers and small carved toys as gifts for the babies. The generosity and kindness of these people overwhelmed Sarah, who had almost forgotten that such compassion existed in the world. Modoc visited frequently, checking on their progress and discussing plans for their future. He explained that the village could provide temporary sanctuary, but they would need to make longer-term arrangements for safety. The plantation owner would likely send search parties once he discovered their absence, and the village could be in danger if they were found harboring runaway slaves. "There are places further north where you can live freely," Modoc told Sarah. "Communities where former slaves have built new lives for themselves and their families. But the journey is long and difficult, especially with young children." Sarah listened carefully to his words, weighing the options. She was grateful beyond measure for the help they had received, but she understood that they couldn't remain in the village indefinitely. The Modoc people had already taken significant risks by helping them, and she didn't want to bring danger to these generous people. As the day progressed, the twins continued to improve steadily. They were able to take larger amounts of nourishment, and their alertness increased noticeably. Mary even managed a weak smile when one of the village children made funny faces at her, and Samuel's grip strengthened when Sarah held his tiny hand. The village women taught Sarah techniques for caring for malnourished children, showing her how to prepare special foods that would help rebuild their strength gradually. They explained which herbs could help with digestion and which could boost the immune system. This knowledge would be invaluable as they continued their journey toward freedom. By evening, the twins were strong enough to sit up for short periods with support. They were taking regular feedings and had regained some of the weight they had lost during their weeks of starvation. The village celebrated their progress with a small ceremony, offering prayers of gratitude for their recovery. As night fell once again, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary change in their circumstances. Her children were alive and growing stronger by the hour. She had found allies and friends among people she had never expected to meet, and for the first time since leaving the plantation, she felt genuine hope for their future. The twins slept peacefully that night, their breathing steady and their color improving. Sarah watched over them, still hardly believing that the nightmare of starvation was behind them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions about their future. But tonight, they were safe, fed, and surrounded by caring people. The village had given them more than food and medicine. It had given them back their lives and their hope for a better future. Sarah fell asleep that night with tears of gratitude on her cheeks, listening to the healthy breathing of her children and the gentle sounds of the village settling in for the night. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah and her twins had arrived at the Modoc village more dead than alive. The transformation in their condition was remarkable. Mary and Samuel had regained their healthy weight and were beginning to show the curious, active behavior typical of babies their age. They laughed when the village children played with them, reached for colorful objects, and had developed healthy appetites that kept Sarah busy with constant feedings. Sarah herself had also recovered dramatically. The proper nutrition and rest had restored her strength, and the stress lines that had marked her face during the worst days of starvation had softened. She had even begun to help with daily tasks around the village, contributing what she could to repay the kindness she had received. However, the peaceful respite could not last forever. 3 days earlier, scouts from the village had spotted search parties in the distance. Word had reached them that Master Whitmore was offering a substantial reward for information about Sarah and her children. The bounty hunters were getting closer, and soon they would likely reach the village. Modoc had spent considerable time planning their next move. He had consulted with the village elders and contacted allies in other communities to arrange safe passage for Sarah and the twins. The plan was ambitious and dangerous, but it offered the best chance for true freedom. There is a settlement called New Haven, about 200 miles north of here, Modoc explained to Sarah one evening as they sat by the fire. It was established by former slaves who escaped during the war. They have built a real community there: schools, farms, shops, everything needed for a good life. Sarah listened intently as Modoc described the journey ahead. They would travel mostly at night to avoid detection, following a network of safe houses and friendly contacts who had agreed to help along the way. The trip would take several weeks, and much of it would be through difficult terrain. The Yamamoto family, Japanese farmers who settled in the mountains, will shelter you for a few days, Modoc continued. Then you'll stay with the Pattersons, a white family who are active in helping refugees. Finally, there's a Paiute village about 50 miles from New Haven, where you can rest before the final leg of the journey. The complexity of the underground network amazed Sarah. She had never imagined that so many different people were working together to help those seeking freedom. Each group faced risks by participating, yet they continued to offer aid to strangers in desperate need. Preparations for departure began immediately. The village women worked together to create a special sling that would allow Sarah to carry both twins safely during long walks. They prepared dried foods that would provide good nutrition and keep well during travel. They also assembled a collection of medicines and herbs that could help if anyone became sick on the journey. Gentle Rain spent hours teaching Sarah about wilderness survival skills she might need: how to find safe water, which plants were edible, how to read weather signs, and ways to stay hidden if they encountered danger. Sarah absorbed every piece of information, knowing her children's lives might depend on these lessons. Wise Owl prepared special protective charms for the babies, small pouches containing herbs and stones that she believed would guard them from harm during the dangerous journey. Whether or not Sarah believed in their magical properties, she appreciated the love and care that went into making them. The night before their departure, the entire village gathered for a farewell ceremony. They shared a feast featuring the best foods they could prepare, and many people offered gifts for the journey: warm blankets, dried meat, small tools, and silver coins that could be used to buy supplies or assistance if needed. During the ceremony, Modoc stood and addressed the gathering. "We have been honored to help this family," he said. "They remind us that courage and love can overcome even the greatest hardships. We send them forward with our blessings and our hopes for their happiness in their new life." Many villagers approached Sarah individually to say goodbye and offer final words of encouragement. The children who had played with Mary and Samuel seemed particularly sad to see them go, and they pressed small handmade toys into Sarah's hands as parting gifts. As dawn approached, it was time for departure. Modoc would personally escort them for the first part of the journey, ensuring they reached the Yamamoto farm safely. After that, they would be passed from one helper to another until they reached New Haven. The twins were secured in their traveling sling, still sleepy from the early hour but content and healthy. Sarah wore the warmest clothes the villagers could provide, and she carried a pack containing food, medicine, and other supplies. She felt both excited and terrified about the journey ahead. The first day of travel took them through dense forest and rocky hills. Modoc set a steady but manageable pace, stopping frequently to check on the babies and allow Sarah to rest. They followed animal trails and creek beds, avoiding any paths that might be watched by bounty hunters. By afternoon, they could see the smoke from the Yamamoto farm in the distance. The family had been expecting them, and they were welcomed warmly despite the language barriers. Mr. Yamamoto spoke limited English, but his wife communicated effectively through gestures and smiles as she prepared a comfortable place for Sarah and the twins to sleep. The Yamamoto children, curious about the babies, helped entertain Mary and Samuel, while the adults discussed the next stage of the journey. Mrs. Yamamoto prepared a special soup that she indicated would help keep Sarah's strength up during the difficult travel ahead. After 2 days with the Japanese family, they continued their journey. This time, Sarah traveled alone, following detailed directions Modoc had given her to reach the Patterson farm. The path was more challenging, requiring her to navigate rocky terrain while carrying both babies, but her confidence had grown during the earlier stages of the trip. The Patterson family received her with open arms. Mrs. Patterson, a gentle woman in her 50s, immediately took charge of caring for the twins, while Sarah rested from the difficult journey. Mr. Patterson, a retired minister, spent time talking with Sarah about her plans for the future and offering encouragement for the challenges ahead. "Freedom is more than just escaping slavery," he told her one evening. "True freedom comes when you can build the life you choose for yourself and your children. New Haven will give you that opportunity." The Pattersons' teenage daughter, Emma, taught Sarah basic reading and writing skills during their stay. She explained that education would be important for both Sarah and her children in their new community. Sarah absorbed the lessons eagerly, amazed at how quickly she was able to learn when given the opportunity. After a week with the Patterson family, Sarah continued toward the Paiute village that would be her final stop before reaching New Haven. This leg of the journey was the most difficult yet, crossing high mountain passes where the air was thin and the weather unpredictable. The twins handled the travel remarkably well, having grown stronger and more resilient during their weeks of proper care. They seemed to enjoy the changing scenery and the rhythm of constant movement. Sarah marveled at their adaptability and felt proud of their courage. The Paiute village was smaller than the Modoc settlement but equally welcoming. The people there had their own stories of displacement and struggle, and they understood the courage required to leave everything behind in search of a better life. They shared what they could and offered final preparations for the last stretch of the journey. An elderly Paiute man named Running Bear served as Sarah's guide for the final approach to New Haven. He had made the trip many times, helping other refugees reach the settlement safely. His knowledge of the terrain and ability to read signs of danger proved invaluable during the 3-day journey. As they crested the final hill before New Haven, Sarah saw the settlement spread out below them. It was larger and more established than she had expected, with neat rows of houses, cultivated fields, and what appeared to be a school and church. Smoke rose from chimneys, and people could be seen going about their daily activities. "Your new home," Running Bear said simply, pointing toward the settlement. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at the community that represented the end of their long journey toward freedom. The twins, sensing her emotion, looked around curiously at their new surroundings. Mary babbled happily, as if she too understood that something important was happening. The descent into New Haven was like entering a completely different world. People came out of their houses to greet the new arrivals, and Sarah was immediately surrounded by families eager to welcome her and the twins. Many of the residents had their own stories of escape and struggle, and they understood exactly what Sarah had endured to reach their community. Mrs. Henderson, one of the settlement's founders, took charge of helping Sarah get established. She arranged temporary housing and introduced Sarah to other families with young children. She explained how the community worked, from the farming cooperative that provided food to the school that educated the children to the democratic council that made important decisions. Everyone here contributes according to their abilities, Mrs. Henderson explained. We've built something special. A place where our children can grow up free and educated, where we control our own destiny. Sarah was assigned a small but comfortable house near the center of town. It had 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a small garden plot where she could grow vegetables. After months of uncertainty and danger, having a place of her own felt almost too good to be true. The twins thrived in their new environment. Other children in the settlement quickly adopted them as little siblings, and there was always someone willing to help Sarah with their care. Mary and Samuel seemed to sense the security and happiness around them, developing into cheerful, curious babies who brought joy to everyone they met. As weeks turned into months, Sarah built a new life in New Haven. She learned to read and write fluently, helped establish a nursery for working mothers, and contributed to the community garden that fed the entire settlement. She made close friendships with other women who had survived similar ordeals, and together they created a support network for newcomers still arriving. The twins grew into healthy, active toddlers who knew nothing of slavery or starvation. They played freely with children of all backgrounds, learned their letters in the community school, and grew up believing that freedom and opportunity were their birthright. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Sarah would think back to that desperate day when she had collapsed by the stream, watching her children die in her arms. The transformation from that moment of absolute despair to their current life of security and hope seemed almost impossible to believe. She often thought of Modoc and the village that had saved their lives. Messages occasionally reached New Haven through the underground network, bringing news that her rescuers were well and continuing their work of helping others. Sarah always sent back her gratitude and updates on the twins' progress, knowing that their success brought joy to those who had made it possible. Years later, when Mary and Samuel were old enough to understand, Sarah would tell them the story of their journey to freedom. She would describe the kindness of strangers who risked everything to help them, the courage required to keep fighting when hope seemed lost, and the importance of helping others who faced similar struggles. The twins, by then young adults with children of their own, would listen to these stories with wonder and pride. They understood that their lives had been built on the sacrifices and bravery of many people, and they carried forward the tradition of helping others whenever possible. Sarah lived to see her grandchildren grow up free and educated, never knowing the fear and degradation that had marked her own early life. She had achieved what had once seemed impossible, breaking the cycle of enslavement and creating a legacy of freedom for future generations. The small gravestone that eventually marked Sarah's resting place in the New Haven Cemetery bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of her remarkable journey. She transformed despair into hope, starvation into abundance, slavery into freedom, for herself and for all who followed.